after serving my son and his wife. For 10 years, I was kicked out. 3 months later, I took their house. After 10 years of service, after raising their children and running their home, my son and his wife kicked me out. The final sharp click of my suitcase closing was the sound of a chapter of my life ending, but they had no idea what chapter I was about to open. My name is Margaret Ellison. For the last decade, this grand house in Charleston, with its sweeping porches and ancient magnolia trees, was my home. Or so I thought. I was folding the last of my silk scarves, the ones my late husband Arthur always said matched my eyes. The afternoon sun, golden and lazy, streamed through the large bedroom window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was a beautiful, tranquil scene that felt like a lie. Every object in this room held a memory. Every piece of polished wood was a testament to a life I had built, not just for myself, but for them, for my son, Thomas, and his wife, Vanessa. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. I heard a sound and looked up. Vanessa was standing there, leaning against the doorframe, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She didn't step into the room. She maintained her distance as if the space around me was contaminated. Her face was a carefully composed mask of indifference, an expression I suspected she had rehearsed in the mirror. She was dressed in a sharp, modern pantsuit, a stark contrast to the classic elegance of the room and to me. She cleared her throat, a small, impatient sound. "We've decided it's time for you to have your own space, Margaret," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion, like a CEO delivering bad news. "It's for the best." Margaret, not Mom, not even Mother Ellison as she sometimes called me in front of her high society friends. Just Margaret. It was a deliberate severing, a final demotion from family to acquaintance. My hands, which had been steady moments before, trembled slightly. I quickly clenched them into fists at my sides, my nails digging into my palms. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing my weakness. I didn't answer her. What was there to say? Arguing was pointless. Pleading was beneath me. Instead, I turned my gaze to the small, silver-framed photograph on my nightstand. It was Arthur and me on our wedding day, young and impossibly happy. His eyes, even in the black and white photo, seemed to sparkle with love and protection. He would never have allowed this. He would have stood between me and the world. But Arthur was gone, and I was alone. With deliberate slowness, I picked up the frame. I ran my thumb over the cool glass, over his smiling face. Then, I placed it gently on top of the folded scarves inside my suitcase. It was the last thing to go in. The most important thing. My silence seemed to unnerve Vanessa more than any shouting match could have. She shifted her weight, the fabric of her expensive suit rustling. I looked at the suitcase. It wasn't new or flashy. It was an old leather case, worn at the corners, that had traveled the world with Arthur and me. 10 years. 10 years of my life, of my love, of my labor, all packed away into this single, tired-looking box. I reached down and closed the lid, the two heavy latches clicking shut, one after the other, loud and final. Then I pulled the zipper around its edge, a sharp and decisive sound. I straightened up, my back as rigid as the iron fences that lined these Charleston streets. I picked up the suitcase. It felt heavier than it should have, weighted down by more than just clothes and a photograph. It was weighted down by 10 years of unthanked dinners, unseen sacrifices, and unheard pleas for respect. I walked towards the door, towards Vanessa. I kept my eyes fixed on a point on the wall just past her shoulder. I would not look at her. I would not let her see the storm raging behind my eyes. As I passed, she didn't move an inch. She was a statue carved from ice. I could feel her cold gaze on my back as I walked out of the room, out of the life I had known. "It's for the best," she had said. The words echoed in the grand, silent hallway, and as my hand closed around the smooth, cool wood of the banister to guide my first step down the stairs and away from them, a new, cold thought began to form in my mind. Maybe it was. But not for them. It was for me. The grand staircase of the Charleston house curved before me like a fossilized spine. Each of the 20 steps down to the marble foyer represented 6 months of my life, 10 years in total. My hand rested on the smooth, cool wood of the banister, my knuckles white and strained, not just from the weight of the suitcase, but from the sudden, crushing weight of memory. It started with a phone call, not long after Arthur passed. Thomas's voice, thick with a syrupy concern that, in retrospect, was probably more for his own convenience than for my grief. "Come live with us, Mom," he'd urged. "You shouldn't be alone in that big house. We need you. It'll be better for everyone." I was so lost in my sorrow that his words felt like a lifeline. I sold the home Arthur and I had shared for 40 years and moved in, ready to be a mother again, a grandmother, a part of a family. I was ready to serve, and I did. My first few steps down the stairs brought back the burn of the ovens, the endless parties. Vanessa loved to entertain Thomas's clients, but she didn't love the work that went with it. So I became the woman behind the curtain. I'd spend days planning menus, roasting chickens until their skin was golden and crisp, arranging canapes on silver platters. I remember the steam fogging my glasses as I pulled a rack of lamb from the oven, just as the doorbell began to ring. I'd hear Thomas and Vanessa's laughter from the foyer, accepting praise for the wonderful food, the beautiful home. My hands, which had once been soft enough for fine embroidery, grew calloused from peeling potatoes and strong from kneading dough. Halfway down, the memory shifted from the heat of the kitchen to the damp earth of the garden. The famous roses of 14 Magnolia Lane. Vanessa loved to point them out to her garden club friends, but it was my knees that ached from kneeling in the soil, my fingers that were pricked by thorns. I learned the rhythm of the seasons in that garden, the language of the flowers. I poured my love for Arthur into that soil, and it bloomed in vibrant reds and pinks. They just saw it as a pretty backdrop for their weekend cocktails. Another step, and I saw a small, feverish face. My grandson, Leo. He was only 6, and a terrible flu had swept through his school. Thomas and Vanessa were on a critical business trip in the Bahamas. For 3 nights, I barely slept. I sat by his bed, dabbing his forehead with a cool cloth, whispering stories Arthur used to tell me, and holding his small, sweaty hand until the fever broke. I remember the profound relief, the deep, primal love I felt for that little boy. When his parents returned, tanned and rested, Vanessa thanked me by handing me a pile of laundry from their trip. Lower now, almost to the bottom. The memories grew sharper, more painful. I remembered sitting in Dr. Miller's sterile office, the white paper crinkling beneath me. He'd held up my chart, his face grim. "Margaret, your bone density is concerning," he'd said, his voice serious. "You need to avoid heavy lifting. Seriously." I'd nodded, promising I would take it easy. 2 days later, Vanessa came home with their enormous SUV packed with groceries from a bulk shopping trip. She'd sighed dramatically, placing a hand on her lower back. "Oh, Margaret, my back is just acting up terribly today. Would you be a darling and get these?" So I did. I carried the heavy cases of water, the oversized bags of dog food, the sacks of flour, making trip after trip from the car to the pantry. Each time, I felt a twinge in my own back, a dull ache in my hip, but I ignored it. My health had always taken a back seat. The last memory, the one that hit just as my foot touched the cold marble of the foyer, was the sharpest of all. It was about the pearl necklace Arthur had given me for our 25th anniversary. Leo had been accepted into a prestigious private school, and I'd overheard Thomas and Vanessa arguing in hushed, frantic tones in their study. "We're just a little short," Thomas had said, his voice strained. The next morning at breakfast, Vanessa mentioned how wonderful it would be for Leo to attend, looking pointedly at me. I understood. That afternoon, I found myself at the jeweler's, the same one Arthur had always trusted. The velvet box opened with a soft sigh. The pearls gleamed with a soft internal light, like tiny moons. Parting with them felt like parting with a piece of my own history, a piece of Arthur. The jeweler wrote the check without a word. Later, I looked at the receipt from the sale. $5,000. It was the exact amount listed on Leo's tuition bill for the first semester. I never told them what it cost me. They never asked. They just took the money with relieved smiles, and the subject was never mentioned again. I stood there in the foyer, the suitcase handle digging into my palm. The silence of the house was immense. It wasn't a home. It was a museum of my sacrifices, a monument to my own gradual erasure. 10 years. I had given them my time, my health, my history, and my heart. And in return, they had given me the front door. The first real crack in the foundation appeared not with a bang, but with the clatter of a silver fork against fine china. It happened a few months before they kicked me out, during one of Vanessa's meticulously staged dinner parties. The guests were a Mr. and Mrs. Davenport. He was a potential investor. Thomas was desperately trying to court. The house was immaculate, the candles were lit, and the low hum of polite conversation filled the dining room. I felt a familiar sense of quiet pride. This was what I did. I created the perfect backdrop for their lives to unfold. That night, I had outdone myself. The main course was my signature roasted chicken, a recipe Arthur had adored. I'd brined it for hours, stuffed it with lemon and rosemary from my own garden, and roasted it until the skin was so crisp it crackled if you looked at it too long. When I brought it to the table on a heavy silver platter, garnished with fresh herbs, it was a work of art. A hush fell over the table. Mr. Davenport let out a low whistle of appreciation. "My goodness, Margaret," he boomed, his eyes wide. "That looks absolutely magnificent. You'll have to give my wife the recipe." I smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "It's all in the love you put into it, Mr. Davenport." I began to carve, serving everyone a generous portion. Thomas watched me, a flicker of pride in his own eyes. For a moment, it felt like old times. It felt like family. Then Vanessa made her move. She picked up her fork and knife and poked at the chicken as if it were a strange scientific specimen. She cut a tiny, almost microscopic piece and placed it in her mouth, chewing slowly, her brow furrowed in concentration. The whole table watched her, waiting for the verdict. She swallowed, took a delicate sip of her wine, and then set her fork down on her plate with a sharp, deliberate clatter that cut through the quiet hum of the room. It was a sound of dismissal. "Margaret's cooking is very traditional," she announced to Mrs. Davenport, though her voice was loud enough for the whole table to hear. She smiled a tight, saccharine smile. "We're trying to move towards a more modern palate in this house. Lighter fare, you know." The air went still. The comment hung there, thick and suffocating. It wasn't just an insult to my chicken. It was an insult to me, to my entire way of being. She was painting me as a relic, an outdated fixture in her sleek modern life. Mr. Davenport cleared his throat awkwardly, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on his plate. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck, but I held my head high. My eyes flickered to Thomas, pleading with him to say something, to defend me. He met my gaze for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, I saw it all: guilt, shame, and above all, fear. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then I saw a subtle movement under the table. Vanessa's hand had shot out and squeezed his knee, a silent, vicious command. "Shut up!" He obeyed instantly. His mouth closed. His eyes darted away from mine, fixing on the window as if the view of the dark garden was the most fascinating thing in the world. He was a ship abandoning its anchor in a storm. "It's fine, Vanessa," he mumbled, his voice weak, directed at his plate. "It's delicious, Mom." The word Mom felt like a token, a flimsy bandage on a gaping wound. It was too little, too late. The damage was done. Vanessa had drawn a line in the sand, and my own son had just watched me be pushed to the other side of it. He had chosen his wife, his ambition, his fear over his mother. I picked up my wine glass, my hand perfectly steady. I smiled my most serene hostess smile at Mrs. Davenport, who looked deeply uncomfortable. "More wine, dear?" I asked, my voice as smooth as cream. I was a ghost at my own feast. I moved around the table, topping up glasses, my movements fluid and practiced, while on the inside, I was crumbling. The rest of the dinner was a blur of forced conversation and hollow laughter. I watched as Vanessa charmed the Davenports, steering the conversation towards her charity work and Thomas's bold investment strategies. The beautiful golden chicken sat on their plates, largely ignored. It was no longer food. It was a symbol of the traditional world Vanessa was so eager to discard. My world. Later that night, as I cleared the plates, I saw that Thomas had barely touched his meal. He couldn't look at me. The first crack had appeared, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was only a matter of time before the whole foundation came crashing down. A few weeks after the disastrous dinner party, the tension in the house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Thomas was on the verge of landing the biggest deal of his career, a partnership with a notoriously sharp British investor named Alistair Sterling. This deal was everything to him. It was the lifeline that would pull him out of the financial hole he'd been digging. But it was slipping through his fingers. I found him one evening in his home office, a room paneled in dark, imposing mahogany that always felt more like a cage than a workspace. He was pacing back and forth like a trapped animal, his tie loosened, his hair a mess from running his hands through it. Papers were scattered across his desk, and a half-empty glass of whiskey sat sweating on a coaster. He was muttering to himself, a litany of numbers and risks. "He's just not biting," he said. Not to me, but to the room. "I've thrown everything at him. The numbers are solid. The projections are aggressive. He's just cold, unimpressed." I stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching him. I knew this kind of man, the Alistair Sterlings of the world. They weren't moved by numbers alone. They were men of a different era, men who valued substance and character over flash. "Perhaps you're offering him the wrong thing, Thomas," I said quietly. He spun around, startled. "Mom, I didn't see you. The wrong thing? I'm offering him a 10% return in the first year. What could be more right than that?" "You're trying to impress his wallet," I said, stepping into the room. "You need to speak to his heart." He scoffed, picking up his whiskey glass. "His heart? Mother, this is a multi-million-dollar deal, not a poetry reading." "Everyone has a heart, Thomas. And every man, no matter how powerful, has a home he remembers." I told him what I had learned from a friend in the garden club whose husband had done business with Sterling before. He was a man of immense wealth, but he'd grown up in the English countryside, He was sentimental about his roots. A gift, I said. Something personal. Something that shows you see him as a man, not just a bank account. Vanessa chose that moment to walk by the open door. She paused, leaning against the frame with that familiar dismissive smirk. A gift? Margaret, we're not trying to bribe him with a fruit basket. I ignored her. I walked over to my sewing box, which I kept on a small table in the corner, and took out a spool of ivory-colored silk thread, thick and lustrous. I have an idea, I said. For the next 2 hours, I sat in my armchair while Thomas fretted and Vanessa occasionally glanced in with disdain. My fingers, nimble from years of practice, went to work. I began to weave the silk thread, my hands moving in a dance they'd known for decades. I was creating a southern magnolia knot, a complex and beautiful design that mimics the petals of our state flower. It was a symbol of endurance, of beauty, of home. It was a piece of Charleston, a piece of me. As I worked, I thought of Arthur and how he'd watch my hands for hours, calling them my own special magic. When I was finished, the knot lay in my palm, perfect and intricate. I placed it inside a small dark wooden box I kept from Arthur, its interior lined with faded black velvet. It looked elegant, timeless. The meeting was the next day at the house. Mr. Sterling was exactly as I'd pictured, tall, impeccably dressed, with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. After an hour of tense discussion in the office, where Thomas laid out the final proposal, the moment came. Mr. Sterling, Thomas said, his voice a little shaky. Before you make your final decision, my mother wanted you to have this, a small token of our southern hospitality. He pushed the small wooden box across the polished desk. I watched from the doorway as Sterling picked it up. He looked at it quizzically for a moment before opening the lid. His eyes fell on the silk magnolia knot nestled in the velvet. He didn't speak. He simply stared at it. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Thomas began to fidget. Vanessa, standing beside him, rolled her eyes so subtly only I could see it. Then, Mr. Sterling reached in with a surprisingly gentle touch and lifted the knot from the box. He turned it over in his fingers, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up, but not at Thomas. He looked past him, his gaze finding me in the doorway. And for the first time, the coldness in his eyes was gone, replaced by something soft and distant, something that looked like memory. My grandmother, he said, his voice quiet and thick with an emotion he quickly tried to suppress. She used to have a magnolia tree right outside my bedroom window when I was a boy. How incredibly thoughtful. Thank you. He didn't say another word about the business. He simply shook Thomas's hand, nodded at me, and left. Thomas was confused. Vanessa was annoyed. Well, that was a waste of time, she muttered as the front door closed. An hour later, the phone rang. It was Sterling's assistant. The deal was on. Thomas was ecstatic, punching the air in victory. He immediately started making calls, claiming his final pitch had done the trick. He never mentioned the gift again. That evening, I overheard Vanessa talking to Thomas as I cleared the dinner plates. Honestly, she said with a laugh, I can't believe you were so worried. He was probably just being polite. It was just a bit of string after all. A bit of string. That's all she saw. She hadn't seen the magic. She hadn't seen the memory. She hadn't seen the key that unlocked a man's heart and secured her husband's future. And in that moment, I knew she never would. With the Sterling deal secured, a new, suffocating air of confidence settled over the house. Vanessa, in particular, was insufferable. She began hosting more social events, small, intimate gatherings where she could solidify her position as the wife of Charleston's new rising star. The most painful of these was a Tuesday afternoon tea party. The living room was bathed in that soft, hazy Carolina light. 4 women, dressed in expensive linen and dripping with delicate gold jewelry, were arranged on the plush sofas. Their laughter was light and brittle, like wind chimes. I was in the kitchen, arranging my freshly baked lemon and lavender scones on a 3-tiered silver tray. I could hear their conversation drift in and out. It was the usual talk: gossip about the yacht club, complaints about contractors, plans for summer trips to Europe. Vanessa was holding court, her voice a little louder than everyone else's, her laugh a little too sharp. I picked up the heavy tray, the porcelain teapot steaming with Earl Grey, and pushed the swinging door open with my hip. I entered the living room just as one of the women, a newcomer to the group named Cynthia, gestured towards the family photos on the mantelpiece. "That's a lovely photo, Vanessa," she said, her voice genuinely warm. "Is that your mother?" She was pointing to a picture of me and Thomas, taken years ago at his college graduation. My heart gave a small, foolish leap. Vanessa let out that sharp, practiced laugh. She tossed her perfectly highlighted hair over her shoulder. "Goodness, no. That's Margaret, Thomas's mother." "Oh," Cynthia said, a little confused. "She lives with you, then?" I froze mid-step, halfway between the kitchen door and the coffee table. The silver tray suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. I was hidden from their direct line of sight by a large, ornate armchair, but I could hear every word as clearly as if it were whispered in my ear. And then Vanessa delivered the blow. It wasn't a shout. It was worse. It was a casual, condescending whisper, designed to sound like a shared secret among friends, but loud enough for its intended target to hear. "Oh, Margaret?" she said, her tone dripping with false pity. "She's family, of course, but well, it's a bit of a charity case, you know, another mouth to feed. But what can you do?" The words hit me with physical force. A charity case, another mouth to feed. The air left my lungs. For a moment, the room tilted, the polite chatter fading into a dull roar in my ears. I took a shaky step sideways and set the heavy tray down on a side table, my hands trembling so badly I was afraid I would drop the whole thing. My back was to them. I stood there, staring at the cold white marble of the fireplace mantel. Without thinking, my hand reached out and gripped the edge of it, my fingers digging into the unyielding stone, grounding me. I squeezed until my knuckles were white, until the sharp edge bit into my palm. I forced myself to breathe. In, out. I straightened my spine, refusing to slump, refusing to show them they had wounded me. The silence that followed her remark was deafening. The light, brittle laughter had vanished. I could feel their eyes on my back. Then I heard Cynthia's voice, cool and clipped. "Well, she must be a wonderful help. These scones smell divine." It was a small act of kindness, a clear rebuke of Vanessa's cruelty, and I was immensely grateful for it. Slowly, I turned around, and I met Vanessa's eyes across the room. There was no shame on her face, no regret, just a cool, challenging stare. It was a dare. "What are you going to do about it?" She had thrown down the gauntlet in front of her friends, asserting her dominance, putting me firmly in my place. She was the lady of the manor. I was the help. The burden. I gave her nothing. I smoothed down my apron, my face a mask of serene neutrality. I walked over to the coffee table, picked up the teapot, and began to pour. My hand was perfectly steady now, fueled by a surge of cold, hard anger. "Mrs. Davenport," I said, my voice even. "Cream and sugar?" The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. The other women began talking all at once, their chatter too fast, too bright, filling the void Vanessa had created. They complimented the scones, the tea, the house, anything to avoid acknowledging what had just happened. I served each of them, my movements graceful and deliberate. When I came to Vanessa, I met her gaze again. Her smirk was gone, replaced by a flicker of annoyance that I hadn't crumbled, that I hadn't fled the room in tears. I had denied her the drama she craved. I finished my duties and retreated to the kitchen, closing the door softly behind me. I leaned against it, closing my eyes, and the words echoed in my head. A charity case, another mouth to feed. It was no longer just a crack in the foundation. A wall had been built between me and them, and on it, she had painted my new identity in big, bold letters for the whole world to see. I wasn't family. I was a problem to be managed. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that they would soon decide they were tired of managing it. The final thread snapped on a Tuesday. It was a gray, overcast afternoon, the kind where the sky feels heavy and low. I was in the main hall, polishing the silver on a console table, a task I found meditative, when Thomas came rushing in through the front door. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. His face was pale and slick with a clammy sweat, his eyes wide with a frantic, cornered animal terror. He was at the end of his rope. He was clutching a letter in his hand, his knuckles white. It was an official-looking envelope, and he held it like it was a venomous snake. He saw me and stopped, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. "Mom, I need to talk to you." I put down my polishing cloth, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I had never seen him like this, not even when the Sterling deal was on the line. This was different. This was raw panic. "What is it, Thomas? What's happened?" He stumbled towards me, thrusting the letter at me. "It's over. The market turned. That last investment, it was a bust. I'm wiped out, Mom. Completely." He ran a shaky hand through his hair. "They're calling in the loans, all of them. I'm ruined." I took the letter but didn't read it. I didn't need to. I could see the truth in my son's terrified eyes. He was backed into a corner, and he was looking to me for a way out. "Mom," he whispered, his voice dropping to a desperate plea. "The business, everything, I just need a little more help. A bridge loan just to get me through. Your savings, the money from Dad's portfolio. It's the only thing left." He was asking for the last of it. The very last of the safety net Arthur had left for me, the money that was supposed to see me through my old age. I looked at my son, at the man I had raised, now reduced to this trembling, desperate shell, and my heart ached for him. Despite everything, he was still my child. I opened my mouth to answer, to console him, to figure something out, but I never got the chance. "Absolutely not." The voice came from the top of the stairs. It was Vanessa. She had clearly been listening. She descended the staircase slowly, her face a mask of cold fury. Her eyes weren't on me. They were locked on her husband with pure contempt. "Have you lost your mind?" she hissed at him. "You are not touching her money. That's our money. That's the house money." "Vanessa, you don't understand," Thomas pleaded, turning to her. "We have nothing left. This is the only way." "No!" She reached them, snatching the letter from my hand before I could react. She didn't even glance at it. Her eyes were blazing. "The only way is for you to be a man and fix the mess you made. You will not drag us down with you." She took a step closer to him, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I did not claw my way up from nothing to lose it all, because you're a failure." Then she turned to me. Her face, which had been contorted with rage at her husband, shifted into something else entirely. It was a look of pure, unadulterated resentment, as if I were the source of all her problems, as if my very existence was an offense. the final straw that broke the camel's back. She took a deep breath, and with a voice that echoed in the high-ceilinged hall, she screamed the words that would change everything. "This is our house. Our money. You don't own anything here, Margaret." The world stopped. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to fall silent. The name, Margaret, shot out like a bullet, severing the last frayed thread of familial connection. My concern for Thomas, my pity, my motherly instinct, it all vanished in an instant, replaced by a profound, chilling emptiness. It was as if a switch had been flipped inside me. The part of me that felt, that cared, that forgave, simply shut down. I looked from her face, twisted with rage, to my sons, crumpled in weak despair. I saw them for what they were. Not family, just two people in a house I happened to live in. I said nothing. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply turned my back on them. With calm, deliberate steps, I walked up the grand staircase, my posture perfect. I could feel their stunned silence behind me. They had expected tears, hysterics, a fight. My absolute stillness was something they didn't know how to handle. I reached my room and closed the door softly behind me. I walked to the antique wardrobe in the corner and knelt down, pulling aside a false panel at the bottom. Behind it was a small, heavy safe. My fingers, steady and sure, spun the combination. A date only I would know. Arthur's birthday. The safe clicked open. I reached inside, past my jewelry box and a few sentimental trinkets, and pulled out a thick, worn manila folder. I opened it on my bed. The top document was old. The paper yellowed with age, but the letterhead was crisp. It was from our old family lawyer, and the title, in bold capital letters, read, "Secured Promissory Note." The war had been declared downstairs, and here, in the quiet of my room, I was finally ready to review my battle plans. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't need to. The cold, hard clarity that had settled over me was more potent than any caffeine. The die was cast. There was no going back, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't want to. While the house slept, shrouded in a tense, exhausted silence, I moved with quiet purpose. I packed my old leather suitcase, the one from Chapter 1, with the few things that were truly mine: my clothes, Arthur's photograph, a handful of books, and the worn manila folder from the safe. Everything else in that room, in that house, was just stuff. It held no meaning for me anymore. I showered and dressed before the sun came up, choosing a simple but elegant navy blue dress. I did my hair and put on a touch of lipstick. This was not a retreat. It was a departure. I would not leave looking like a victim. The house was eerily still as I walked down the grand staircase for the last time. The air was stale with the ghosts of yesterday's argument. In the dim pre-dawn light, the opulent furniture looked like sleeping beasts, their polished surfaces gleaming faintly. I walked past the living room where I'd been called a charity case, past the dining room where my cooking had been dismissed, past my son's office where my help had been taken for granted. The house was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, and I had been the victim for 10 years. I entered the kitchen. This room, more than any other, had been my domain. It was the heart of the house where I had poured out my love and energy day after day. Now, it was just a room, cold and impersonal in the gray morning light. The marble countertops were cool and smooth under my fingertips. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key to the front door. For a moment, I just held it in my palm, feeling its weight. It was the key to a cage I had willingly walked into. I had thought it was a sanctuary. I had been wrong. With a quiet, deliberate motion, I placed the key in the very center of the vast marble island. It lay there, small and solitary, a final gleaming statement. It made no sound. There was no clatter, no thud, just a silent surrender of a power I no longer wanted. Next to it, I placed a small cream-colored note card. I had written on it earlier, using my good fountain pen, the one with the black ink. The message was short, the script elegant and controlled. 3 simple words. Thank you for the memories. It was polite. It was final. It was the coldest thing I had ever written. It acknowledged that a past had existed, but it offered no hope for a future. It was a door, quietly and firmly closed. I stood there for a moment, looking at the key and the note. A single golden ray of the rising sun pierced through the kitchen window, striking the marble and making the brass key shine. It was like a spotlight on the end of an act. I took a deep breath, a real one. It felt as if a massive weight, one I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying, was beginning to lift from my shoulders. The constant low-grade anxiety, the need to please, the fear of causing offense. It was all starting to dissolve. I picked up my suitcase. I didn't look around the kitchen one last time. I didn't glance at the family photos on the refrigerator. There was nothing left for me here. I walked through the foyer and pulled open the heavy front door. The morning air hit me. It was cool and crisp, smelling of damp earth and the faint, sweet scent of distant magnolias. It was the smell of freedom. I stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind me. I didn't slam it. I let the lock click softly into place. I walked down the stone pathway, my posture erect, my gaze fixed straight ahead. I did not look back. I would not give that house, or the people inside it, the satisfaction of a backward glance. They had taken 10 years of my life. They would not get one more second of my attention. At the end of the driveway, I stopped and put my suitcase down. I looked up at the vast, open sky, now turning from gray to a soft, promising blue. And for the first time since Arthur died, I breathed. I took a deep, shuddering breath that filled my lungs completely, and as I exhaled, I let the last 10 years go with it. I was 72 years old. I had a small suitcase, a little money, and a secret weapon tucked away in a manila folder. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And it was all mine. The first 3 months of my new life were like waking up from a long, feverish dream. I had found a small, sun-drenched apartment in a quieter part of Charleston, a place with large windows and walls I painted a warm, buttery yellow. There were no grand staircases, no cavernous rooms filled with oppressive silence. There was just me, my books, and the gentle hum of a life I was finally choosing for myself. I had gotten a new lease on life, and it felt wonderful. I reconnected with old friends, women I had let drift away while I was consumed by my duties at that house. My dearest friend, Eleanor, a sharp-witted woman with a laugh that could shake a room, took one look at my new place and declared, "Well, it's about time you came up for air, Margaret." We fell back into our old rhythm of weekly tea parties, not the stiff, performative affairs Vanessa hosted, but loud, joyful gatherings filled with real conversation and shared histories. I even joined a gentle yoga class for seniors. At first, I was clumsy, my body stiff from years of neglect and hard work. But slowly, I began to feel the tension in my shoulders release, the chronic ache in my lower back subside. I was breathing again, not just with my lungs, but with my whole being. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. I had put Thomas and Vanessa out of my mind. I was moving on. Then, reality came knocking, as it always does. I'd just come home from a lovely lunch with Eleanor, my cheeks still warm from laughing. I felt light, almost carefree. I sorted through the small pile of mail on my counter, and there it was, a crisp white envelope from the hospital where I'd had my recent checkup. I opened it, my good mood still buoying me. The feeling didn't last. My eyes scanned the page, past the medical jargon, and landed on the final line item. Total due, $2,500. The number seemed to leap off the page. I sank into a nearby chair, the letter trembling in my hand. $2,500. It wasn't an astronomical sum, but it was a significant chunk of the savings I had. It was a stark, unwelcome reminder of my new vulnerability. In the big house, a bill like this would have been an annoyance. Here, in my small apartment, it was a threat. The comfortable cushion I thought I had was thinner than I'd realized. The peace I had so carefully cultivated began to fray at the edges. I sat there for a long time, staring at the bill, a cold knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. I was just starting to get back on my feet, and now this. It felt like one step forward, two steps back. And then the phone rang. The shrill sound made me jump. I almost didn't answer it. It was an unknown number, but on an impulse, I picked it up. "Hello?" I said, my voice a little shaky. "Good morning," a brisk, professional voice said on the other end. "Is this Mrs. Margaret Ellison?" "Yes, it is," I answered cautiously. "My name is David Chen. I'm a realtor with Charleston Properties," he said. "I'm calling regarding the property at 14 Magnolia Lane." My blood ran cold. I gripped the phone tighter. "What about it?" "Well, Mrs. Ellison," he continued, his tone matter of fact. "I was informed you are the primary lien holder on the property, and I wanted to give you a courtesy call. The current owners, Mr. and Mrs. Ellison, are pursuing a private, off-market sale. They're looking for a quick cash buyer." I was silent. My mind was racing, trying to process his words. Primary lien holder. The term echoed in my head, a phrase I hadn't thought about in a decade. Off-market sale. Quick cash. They were in trouble, and they were trying to sell the house out from under me, hoping I wouldn't find out. They were trying to cash out on the one asset that was tied, legally and morally, to me. The realtor, David, mistook my silence for confusion. "Ma'am, are you there? As the lien holder, any sale would of course have to satisfy your claim first. I just thought you should be aware of the situation." "Yes," I finally managed to say, my voice low and steady, all traces of my earlier panic gone. It had been replaced by something else, a cold, crystalline focus. "Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Mr. Chen. You've been very helpful." I hung up the phone. I looked at the medical bill for $10,500 in my hand. Then I thought of the house, the asset worth hundreds of thousands of dollars that they were trying to liquidate. The two catalysts, the sudden fear for my own financial future and the stunning revelation of their betrayal, merged into one undeniable conclusion. The time for peaceful living was over. They had forced my hand. I had been content to walk away, to leave them to their own devices. But now, they were trying to sell my past, my security, my husband's legacy, to save their own skins. I stood up and walked over to the small desk where I kept my important papers. I pulled out the worn manila folder. It was time to stop being a ghost. It was time to get my ducks in a row. It was time to call my lawyer. The law offices of Howard, Finch, and Associates were a world away from the sleek glass and steel buildings that were popping up all over Charleston. They were housed in a historic brick building downtown, with floors that creaked with dignity and an air that smelled of old paper, leather, and quiet power. This was a place of stability, of history. It was exactly what I needed. Mr. Howard, who had been my husband's lawyer and friend for over 40 years, greeted me himself. He was a man in his late 70s, with a shock of white hair and eyes that were still as sharp as a hawk's. He ushered me into his office, a room lined wall to wall with law books. "Margaret," he said, his voice warm but concerned as he sat down behind his enormous oak desk. "It's been too long. What's going on? Your voice on the phone. You sounded like you'd seen a ghost." I took a deep breath and laid it all out on the table. I told him everything, starting from the day they kicked me out to the realtor's phone call yesterday. I told him about my financial worries, about the sudden, terrifying feeling of being adrift. I spoke calmly, without emotion, presenting the facts as clearly as I could. As I spoke, I pushed the worn manila folder across the polished surface of his desk. He listened patiently, his hand steepled under his chin, his sharp eyes never leaving my face. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. He nodded slowly, then reached for the folder. He opened it, but he barely glanced at the contents. He already knew what was inside. "I remember the day you and Arthur signed this," he said quietly, looking at me over the top of his reading glasses. "He insisted on it. I told him it was probably unnecessary, that family is family." He looked at me and said, "Howard, I'm not protecting Margaret from her enemies. I'm protecting her from her heart." Mr. Howard leaned back in his leather chair, which groaned in protest. "Margaret, what you did for Thomas and Vanessa 10 years ago, it wasn't just a gift. They were about to lose everything. The bank was ready to foreclose on that house. They were in over their heads, and they came to you in desperation." He leaned forward, his expression intent. "You weren't just a co-owner, Margaret. You were their savior. When they were about to be foreclosed on, your husband's insurance money paid off the mortgage in full. This document," he tapped the folder with a long, elegant finger, "isn't a gift. It's a secured promissory note. Legally, they owe you the entire amount, $450,000, plus a decade of interest, or the deed to the house." And the words hung in the quiet, dusty air of the office, or the deed to the house. It was all there, in black and white. The truth I had buried for 10 years. The safety net Arthur had so wisely woven for me. I felt a slow, unfamiliar sensation spread across my face. It was a smile, not a big, joyful smile, but a small, thin, razor-sharp curve of my lips. It wasn't a smile of vengeance. It was a smile of vindication, of justice. Arthur had known. He had seen the future, and he had protected me. "They're trying to sell it," I said, my voice low. "A quick cash sale. They're trying to run." "Then they're in breach of this agreement," Mr. Howard said, his voice now hard as flint. "They cannot sell the asset that secures their debt to you without satisfying that debt first. They're playing with fire, and frankly, they're being incredibly stupid about it." He laid out my options as if they were cards on a table. We could send a cease and desist. We could file an injunction to stop the sale. We could sue them for the full amount owed. Or, he said, pausing for effect, there is another option, a deed in lieu of foreclosure. It's cleaner, faster. Given that they have no other assets to pay what they owe you, you can legally execute your lien and take possession of the property. The house becomes yours, free and clear. I looked out the window at the busy Charleston street below. People were rushing about, living their lives, completely unaware of the monumental shift that was happening in this quiet, book-lined room. For 3 months, I had felt powerless, a victim, a charity case. Now, I held all the cards. The choice was mine. I thought of Vanessa's sneering face as she called me a burden. I thought of Thomas's weak, averted eyes as he let her insult me. I thought of the medical bill sitting on my kitchen counter. My decision wasn't born from a desire to hurt them. It was born from a need to protect myself. It was simple survival. I turned back to Mr. Howard, my resolve hardening into steel. "Let's do it," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Let's take back my house." The next few weeks were a masterclass in legal chess, orchestrated by the calm, methodical mind of Mr. Howard. I was a quiet observer, a queen waiting patiently in the wings while he moved the pawns and bishops into place. He kept me informed every step of the way. First came the official letter of demand, sent by certified mail to 14 Magnolia Lane. It was a formal, ironclad notice of the outstanding debt of $450,000, plus accrued interest, and a demand for immediate payment. It gave them 30 days to respond. "Now we wait, Margaret," Mr. Howard had told me over the phone. "The ball is in their court." The response, when it finally came, was not from Thomas, but from a lawyer he had hired. It was a blustering, dismissive letter, full of legal jargon that amounted to very little. It claimed the promissory note was merely a familial gesture, not a binding contract. It was a weak, desperate attempt to call our bluff. Mr. Howard was not impressed. "They're grasping at straws," he'd said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "They have no legal leg to stand on, and they know it. This is just noise." He sent back a single-page response, citing the specific statutes that made the note legally binding and attaching a copy of the original document with my signature and Arthur's. He also included a final offer: pay the debt within 10 business days, or we would begin foreclosure proceedings. The 10 days came and went in complete silence. It was clear Thomas and Vanessa had chosen their strategy. They buried their heads in the sand, hoping the problem would simply go away. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated Arthur. They had underestimated the power of a promise, written down and signed in black ink, which brought me here, back in Mr. Howard's quiet, book-lined office. It was a crisp December morning. Through the window, I could see festive wreaths on the doors of the buildings across the street. The city was preparing for Christmas. I was preparing for a rebirth. Mr. Howard had a single, important-looking document laid out in the center of his massive oak desk. It was sitting atop a rich, blue folder, the kind reserved for finality. "They never responded to the final notice," he said, his voice calm and even. "Their lawyer called yesterday, trying to stall, asking for an extension. I told him the time for extensions was over. They had their chance to make things right. They chose not to." He slid the document across the desk towards me. "This is it, Margaret, the final step." I looked down at the paper. The legal language was dense, but the title at the top was stark and clear. It read, "Deed in lieu of foreclosure." It was a document of surrender. It stated that in exchange for forgiving the debt they could not pay, the ownership of the property at 14 Magnolia Lane would be transferred to me, the lien holder. It was a quiet, civilized execution. Mr. Howard held out a pen. It wasn't a cheap, disposable one. It was his own personal fountain pen. Heavy and black with a gold nib, it felt substantial in my hand, a tool of immense power. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. I looked at him, my old friend, the man who had helped Arthur protect me from beyond the grave. I thought about the last 10 years, the endless cooking, the thankless cleaning, the aching bones. I thought of Vanessa's sneer as she called me a charity case. I thought of my son's cowardice. I thought of the fear I felt when I saw that medical bill, the terror of facing old age alone and vulnerable. This signature wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of survival. It was the final nail in the coffin of the woman I used to be, the quiet, accommodating, invisible woman who put everyone else's needs before her own. That woman was gone. I uncapped the pen. I dipped the nib into the small pot of ink on the desk, then positioned it over the signature line. My name, Margaret Ellison. For a moment, my hand hovered over the paper. This was the point of no return. I was crossing the Rubicon. Then, with a smooth, decisive stroke, I signed my name. The ink flowed, black and permanent. The signature was elegant, unshakable. The signature of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was doing. I placed the pen down softly on the desk. A profound sense of calm washed over me. It was done. Mr. Howard nodded, a small, satisfied smile on his face. He took the document, reviewed the signature, and then placed it carefully inside the blue folder. "It's done," he said, his voice full of a quiet finality. "Signed, sealed, and delivered. The house is yours, Margaret." He leaned back in his chair and looked at me, his eyes full of respect. "You're a formidable woman." I simply nodded in return. Then, he picked up his telephone. He dialed a number from memory, waiting a moment before he spoke. His voice was all business now, crisp and professional. "Michael," he said into the receiver, "it's finalized. You can serve the notice." It was Christmas Eve. A cold, steady rain was falling outside, tapping a gentle rhythm against the windows of my small, warm apartment. I had a little silver Christmas tree on a side table, its lights twinkling merrily. Carols were playing softly on the radio. For the first time in years, I felt a genuine sense of peace during the holidays. The ghosts of Christmases past, with their forced smiles and simmering resentments, had finally been exorcised. Then came the pounding on my door. It wasn't a knock. It was a frantic, desperate hammering, the sound of someone who had run out of all other options. It shattered the peace in an instant. I turned the radio down, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. I knew who it was. The chickens had finally come home to roost. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It was them. They looked like they had been dragged through a storm. Vanessa's perfect hair was plastered to her head with rain. Her makeup was running, and her expensive coat was soaked. Thomas looked even worse. He was ashen-faced, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He was holding a large, official-looking envelope in his trembling hand. I took a deep, steadying breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and opened the door. I did not open it wide. I opened it just enough to block the doorway with my body. I would not be inviting them in. The moment Thomas saw me, his face crumpled. The last of his composure shattered. He fell to his knees on the doormat, right there in the hallway, like a supplicant before a queen. The envelope fell from his hand, landing with a soft thud. "Mom," he sobbed, the word choked and broken. He reached out a hand, not to touch me, but just in a gesture of utter despair. "Mom, please, I'm ruined. I was a coward. I was so stupid. Please don't do this to us. We have nowhere to go." His breakdown was absolute. He was a broken man, kneeling in the hallway of his mother's apartment on Christmas Eve, his entire world collapsing around him. Vanessa, however, was not broken. She was furious. She looked down at her kneeling husband with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Get up, Thomas," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. She grabbed his arm, trying to haul him to his feet. "Stop groveling. Have you no pride left?" He shook his head, unable to speak, his shoulders heaving with sobs. Vanessa let go of him as if he were something unclean and turned her furious gaze on me. Her eyes were blazing with a hateful fire. "You did this," she spat. "You planned this all along, didn't you? The quiet little mouse in the corner just waiting to strike. How dare you, after everything we did for you? We took you in." The sheer audacity of her words, the breathtaking hypocrisy, almost made me laugh. I simply stared at her, my expression unreadable. My silence, my absolute calm in the face of their chaos, seemed to infuriate her even more. "Say something!" she shrieked. taking a step forward. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just looked down at my son, still weeping on the floor, and then back at his wife, her face twisted with rage and disbelief. I had seen this scene play out in my mind 100 times, and I knew exactly what I needed to say. I finally spoke, my voice not loud, but low and clear, cutting through their hysteria like a shard of ice. "I gave you a home," I said, looking directly into Vanessa's eyes. "You made it a cage. I gave you my love," I continued, my gaze shifting to my son's bowed head. "You made it a burden." I let the words hang in the air for a moment, letting the truth of them sink in. "Now," I said, my voice dropping even lower, colder. "Now you know how it feels to have nowhere to go." I paused, then delivered the final killing blow. "But unlike me," I said, my voice devoid of any pity, "you earned this." A strangled sound escaped Thomas's throat. Vanessa just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. She had finally been rendered speechless. The rug had been pulled out from under her, and she was in free fall. I looked at the official envelope on the floor. I could see the bold red letters through the rain-spotted window. Eviction notice. Vacate the premises within 30 days. Their 30 days were almost up. I had said everything I needed to say. There was nothing more. Without another word, I stepped back and slowly, deliberately closed the door in their faces. The lock clicked into place with a heavy final sound. On the other side, I could hear a single, sharp, agonized cry from Vanessa, followed by the broken sobbing of my son. I leaned my back against the door for a moment, listening to the sound of their ruin. Then, I turned around, walked back into my warm, quiet living room, and turned the Christmas music back up. Spring arrived in Charleston that year not as a quiet suggestion, but as a bold, vibrant declaration. The air, once heavy with winter's chill, was now soft and fragrant, carrying the sweet perfume of jasmine and wisteria. And at 14 Magnolia Lane, things were blooming in more ways than one. The house was mine again, but it was different. I had the entire exterior repainted a brilliant, clean white, and the iconic dark green shutters were now a cheerful, welcoming shade of sky blue. The house no longer looked like an imposing, stuffy monument to the past. It looked bright, airy, and full of life. It looked like me. The biggest change, however, was inside. The cavernous living room, once a stage for Vanessa's tense social dramas, had been completely transformed. The heavy, ornate furniture was gone, replaced by long work tables, comfortable chairs, and shelves brimming with colorful spools of silk, linen, and cotton thread. The room was filled with light, laughter, and the gentle, industrious hum of women at work. This was the home of the Magnolia Workshop. It started as a small idea. After I settled back into the house, my friend Eleanor had joked that I had enough craft supplies to open my own store. The idea took root. I invited her and a few other friends over, women my age who, like me, often found themselves feeling a bit invisible, their skills and stories overlooked. I taught them how to make the Southern Magnolia knot. Word spread. Soon, my living room was filled twice a week with women from all walks of life, their hands busy, their voices weaving stories as intricately as their fingers wove the threads. We weren't just making crafts. We were building a community. We were reminding each other that we still had value, that our hands could still create beauty. Our hands tell our stories, I told them one sunny afternoon, as I helped a new member, a shy widow named Carol, master a tricky part of the knot. My hand rested on hers for a moment, a simple, warm gesture of encouragement. Let's make the next chapter a beautiful one. The woman who had once been called a charity case was now at the head of a thriving little enterprise, We sold our creations at local markets, and through a small online shop Mr. Howard's tech-savvy grandson helped me set up. It wasn't a fortune, but it was ours. It was independence, woven from silk and friendship. I sat now at the desk in what used to be Thomas's office. The imposing mahogany felt different under my touch. It was no longer a place of desperate, fearful ambition. It was my command center. I paid the bills from here, managed our orders, and handled the accounts. Today, I was doing my favorite part of the job. I took out the workshop's checkbook and a fountain pen. With a steady hand, I wrote out a check. The pay to the order of line read, Charleston Senior Support Fund, an organization that helped elderly residents with medical bills and living expenses. The amount was substantial, representing our first quarter's profits. I signed my name at the bottom, a flourish of pride in my signature. I sealed it in an envelope, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over me. This was my legacy now, not bitterness, but betterment. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the lawn, I took a cup of tea out to the front porch. The air was warm. The rocking chair moved in a slow, comforting rhythm. The old magnolia tree in the front yard was covered in huge, white blossoms, their beauty almost breathtaking against the blue evening sky. I set my tea down and picked up the leather-bound journal that was always by my side. I opened it to a fresh page. For months, I had been writing, reclaiming my own story one day at a time. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the pain, the betrayal, the cold fury that had fueled my fight to get my life back. But sitting here now, in my house, on my terms, the anger was gone. It had been replaced by a deep, abiding peace. I no longer thought about Thomas and Vanessa. I had heard through the grapevine that they had moved somewhere up north, that he had taken a low-level sales job. Their story was no longer my concern. I had untethered myself from their fate. My own was far more interesting. I uncapped my pen and began to write, the words flowing easily, truthfully. This home is mine. This life is mine. And my legacy will not be tears, but resilience, like a magnolia blooming after a storm. I closed the journal and leaned back in my chair, taking a sip of my tea. I looked out at the beautiful, enduring tree that had given my workshop its name. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I smiled. A real, genuine smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I was home. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.